correct answer is 1. Psychopathy is associated with reduced identification with moral traits, but this is independent from moral decision making.
The work so far strongly suggests that morality is core to an intact sense of self. What happens, then, when your sense of self is no longer intact? We just saw how a diminished sense of self, as moral, features in psychopathy. Next, we'll look at other ways that we lose ourselves and the effect of this on morally relevant behaviors and attitudes like violence and abuse. The article by Moskowitz focuses on a clinical condition associated with moral identity failure. This condition is important to understand if we want to get the full picture on why individuals behave immorally. This is dissociation. Dissociation involves changes to a number of psychological capacities of cognitive, sensory, and emotional nature, usually due to a disruption in integrated features of consciousness, memory, identity, and perception of the environment. Dissociation is related to a number of psychological capacities in several different clinical disorders. These include dissociative disorder, amnesia, PTSD with flashbacks and emotional numbing and avoidance symptoms. And it's also possibly associated with non-clinical checking out experiences that we might have, including daydreams. At its most intense, dissociation is associated with perpetuation of the cycle of violence. The idea that criminals become criminals through experiences of victimization they themselves first endure. He proposes that dissociation drives the cycle of violence because people who are regularly subjected to violence dissociate in order to cope. This prevents normal psychological functioning and may facilitate abuse or neglect of other people or their own children. He reviews Moskowitz a broad range of populations where a link between dissociation and violence has been found. Young mothers, college students, veterans, prison populations. He shows that dissociation has been found to be driven by and to drive violence, as both a momentary state and as a more enduring trait of dissociation. Essentially, dissociation for coping is hypothesized to prevent normal psychological function and development, and this coping mechanism can become the typical way for a person to cope with extreme stress, which can lead to dissociative violence or abuse. Dissociation is thought to be both driven by and a driver of violence. And this is dissociation as a momentary state or as a more enduring trait or coping response. Moskowitz discusses state dissociation that can trigger violence. The person loses the ability to disambiguate place and time and the identity of the people around them. Early on, the term shell shock was used to identify soldiers' experience of paratraumatic dissociation and mental distress during combat. Now, PTSD includes description of dissociation during and after traumatic events, and also in the re-experiencing flashbacks. It's known that loss of the ability to disambiguate place and time during re-experiencing can facilitate violence. Researchers have found, importantly, that alcohol-related blackouts likely explain a lot of the amnesia around violence, and their mechanisms are still not fully understood. Also, defendants are disproportionately more likely to forget highly emotional, violent parts of crimes in readouts. Faking the symptoms or malingering to avoid accountability can't explain this kind of lack of knowledge about someone's crimes, since it's common for these individuals to remember incriminating parts of events, just not the very emotional parts. In sum, there are many evidence-supported connections and also unanswered questions in areas open for research related to dissociation and the act and experience of violence.